December 17, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay frozen under a pale winter sky. The snow muffled every sound except for one, the steady grinding rumble of engines. Through the gray mist, German generals stood on a ridge, binoculars pressed tight against weary eyes. What they saw chilled them more than the cold ever could. Below, winding through the valleys and stretching far beyond the horizon, an endless column of Allied trucks rolled without pause. Olive-drab vehicles, canvas tops and headlights like a river of steel, mile after mile after mile. At first, the officers thought it was an illusion, some trick of perspective, a convoy that seemed to have no end. But as the hours passed, the truth sank in. These were not just trucks. This was a machine, a living artery of war that pulsed with food, fuel, ammunition, and replacements. Every soldier, every tank, every artillery piece at the front line drew life from this ceaseless flow. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. Months earlier, they had gambled on one final offensive, a desperate strike through the Ardennes that history would call the Battle of the Bulge. They had counted on speed, on surprise, on breaking the fragile Allied lines before American industry could react. They had believed that if they could choke the enemy's supplies, the Western Front would collapse. But here, before their very eyes, was the proof of their miscalculation. The supplies weren't collapsing, they were multiplying. For the German high command, who had lived through years of scarcity, fuel rationing, empty rail cars, factories bombed to rubble, this sight was more terrifying than any weapon. An army can fight against tanks, it can resist against aircraft, but how do you fight against an enemy who seems to have endless lifeblood, delivered in perfect rhythm day and night? The endless convoys told a silent story. The United States was no longer just a nation at war. It had become an arsenal without limits, and yet in that moment the Germans could not know the full truth. They didn't know that these rolling lifelines had their origins long before D-Day. They didn't know that deep in America's factories, shipyards, and assembly lines, a hidden revolution had begun years earlier. A revolution that had transformed ordinary citizens into the backbone of the mightiest supply network the world had ever seen. The convoys would not stop. They would not falter. They would roll forward until the very heart of Germany was broken. But what the Germans didn't know was that this unstoppable stream of trucks had its origins long before D-Day. September 1939. Dawn breaks over Poland. German panzers thunder across the countryside, their tracks cutting black scars through the fields. Above, the Luftwaffe screams in deadly formation, raining fire on bridges, rail yards, and towns. The world watches in awe and in terror as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, carves Europe open in weeks. To many, it seemed as if the German war machine was unstoppable. Swift, precise, modern, a vision of warfare reborn. But beneath the polished armor and daring tactics, there was a fragile secret that few outside the inner circles understood. Germany's early victories were not powered by endless engines and limitless fuel. They were powered, quite literally, by horses. For all the imagery of tanks and trucks, the backbone of German logistics remained almost medieval. In 1941, as their armies prepared to invade the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht relied on more than 600,000 horses to haul wagons, artillery, and supplies. Entire divisions marched in dust and mud, supported by animals dragging wooden carts through the same roads Napoleon's troops had trudged a century before. Yes, there were trucks, but they were scarce, often cobbled together from different makes, models, and even captured civilian vehicles. Spare parts were a nightmare. Engines broke down far from repair depots. Fuel was rationed, then re-rationed again. Even the vaunted panzers were not designed for long-range endurance. They were tactical tools, sharp blades meant for quick cuts, not grinding campaigns. Blitzkrieg, as dazzling as it appeared, masked a deeper weakness. Germany had gambled everything on speed. If battles ended quickly, the fragile supply lines could hold. If wars dragged on, if fronts stretched for hundreds of miles, the illusion of invincibility would crumble. And yet, within the marble halls of Berlin, Adolf Hitler and his generals convinced themselves that lightning would always strike twice. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Norway had been taken in days. Even as Britain held out, German planners believed they could starve the island into submission. Overconfidence became a poison. They dismissed the scale of Allied industry, scoffing at the idea that America, far across the ocean, untested in modern war, could ever mobilize on a scale to challenge them. They pointed to U.S. peacetime production numbers and laughed. To them, the Americans were a nation of consumers, not warriors, a people who built cars for families, not tanks for battle. This arrogance blinded them to the storm already forming across the Atlantic. Because while German troops dragged supplies through mud with horses and wagons, the United States was quietly rewriting the very definition of logistics. Its railroads were being standardized for war. Its automobile factories were preparing to retool. Its industrialists were forging partnerships with the military that would create assembly lines faster, wider, and more efficient than anything Europe had ever imagined. The Germans looked at their victories and saw proof of destiny. But they were standing on quicksand, their armies stretched thin, their fuel stores dwindling, their supply chains fragile. They did not see, or refused to see, that war is not won by brilliant strikes alone. It is won by what happens in the shadows, behind the front lines, where trucks roll, ships sail, and factories hum. The early war gave Hitler the illusion of invincibility, but history would reveal it as overconfidence, born of short wars and blind faith in speed. While the Germans leaned on old methods, across the Atlantic, an industrial giant was preparing to do something never seen before in human history. December 1941, Pearl Harbor burns. Smoke drifts across the Pacific, carrying with it the last illusions of American neutrality. Almost overnight, the United States transforms. Factories that once built refrigerators, washing machines, and automobiles begin retooling for war. The hum of civilian industry shifts into the roar of military production. America, a nation that had never seen itself as a global arsenal, now becomes precisely that. The beating heart of Allied logistics. Franklin D. Roosevelt's famous phrase, "the arsenal of democracy," was not just rhetoric. It became a blueprint. Across the Midwest, the automobile capital of the world reinvented itself. Detroit's assembly lines, once famous for sleek cars rolling out for middle-class families, now poured forth Jeeps, half-tracks, and trucks by the thousands. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant became legendary, producing a bomber every 63 minutes day and night. But it wasn't only planes. Trucks, the unglamorous, overlooked lifeblood of an army, rolled off lines faster than ever before. By the war's end, America would produce nearly 2.4 million trucks, more than all the Axis powers combined. From Studebakers to GMC Deuce and a half 2.5-tonners, they came in every size and type. Each was designed to be rugged, simple to repair, and capable of hauling anything from rations to artillery shells. Fuel, too, was a weapon. American oil fields, particularly in Texas and California, provided a torrent of gasoline and diesel that filled endless convoys of tankers. Tires, spare parts, and tools were mass-produced in staggering numbers. And unlike the Germans, whose supply chains buckled under shortages, the Americans built entire systems of redundancy. If one part failed, another could replace it immediately. The scale was unprecedented. In just 4 years, America produced more than 650,000 Jeeps, millions of rifles, and enough cargo trucks to supply not just its own armies, but those of Britain, the Soviet Union, and Free France. To the Allies, U.S. logistics became a miracle. To the Germans, it was a nightmare. This wasn't simply production, it was strategy. American planners understood that mobility itself could be weaponized. A tank without fuel is just a steel bunker. An army without food is just a mob. But with endless trucks, supplies could be pushed forward relentlessly, allowing frontline units to fight longer, move faster, and strike deeper. Where the German army was bound to rail lines and horse-drawn wagons, the Americans could adapt. Their motorized supply chains meant they could sustain offensives over hundreds of miles, even as terrain shifted from fields to forests to cities. Trucks became as critical as rifles. Wheels, in their own way, won battles, yet this transformation came with growing pains. As Allied armies broke out of Normandy in the summer of 1944, their advance across France was so rapid that it outran its own supply lines. Fuel trucks lagged behind, bridges were bottlenecked, and narrow French roads turned into traffic jams of epic proportions. The arsenal was working too well. The armies raced ahead, but the trucks could not always keep pace. Suddenly, the same mobility that promised victory threatened to choke itself. The question became urgent. How do you keep an army of millions supplied when it's moving faster than its own logistics can follow? But trucks were useless without roads, and the Allies were about to face a nightmare in northern France that threatened to choke the advance. June 1944. The beaches of Normandy are secured, but the real battle has only just begun. The Allied armies pour inland, breaking out from hedgerows and shattered towns. American tanks spear forward. British and Canadian infantry push east. The German defenses reel under the pressure. Victory feels close, almost too close. But behind the front lines, another war begins to unfold. The invasion had been a masterpiece of planning. Millions of tons of equipment were stockpiled in Britain. Thousands of ships ferried troops across the Channel. Yet once the Allies broke through the beachheads, the question became terrifyingly simple. How do you feed, fuel, and arm an army advancing faster than your supply lines can stretch? France in 1944 was no friend to logistics. The ports were ruined, sabotaged by retreating Germans. Railroads lay twisted from Allied bombing campaigns. Bridges collapsed into rivers. The countryside roads never built for convoys of trucks, clogged under the sheer volume of traffic. Dust in summer and mud in autumn slowed movement to a crawl. At first, the Allies celebrated their lightning advances. But within weeks, tanks began to run dry. Soldiers rationed ammunition. The spearheads risked grinding to a halt, not because of enemy fire, but because of empty fuel cans. The harsh truth settled in. Supplies, not courage, were the true limiting factor of war. Faced with this crisis, American ingenuity struck again. The solution would become legendary: the Red Ball Express. In August 1944, the Allies established a dedicated highway system across France. Convoys of trucks, marked with a red ball insignia, drove day and night along guarded routes, hauling everything from rations to artillery shells to gasoline. It was a lifeline, improvised, dangerous, but unstoppable. Most of the drivers were young African-American soldiers, men who faced segregation at home, but carried the weight of an entire army on their shoulders abroad. Working in shifts that left little time for sleep, they drove through blackout conditions, under the constant threat of ambush or air attack. Mud, dust, and exhaustion became their daily companions. They called it the greatest traffic jam in history. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved 12,500 tons of supplies every day. Convoys stretched for miles, wheels grinding relentlessly forward. If a truck broke down, it was pushed aside to keep the flow moving. Nothing, not weather, not fatigue, not enemy fire, could stop it for long. The Red Ball Express turned a looming disaster into a triumph of improvisation. It proved that logistics could adapt as quickly as combat tactics. For every tank that fired, for every soldier who ate, for every mile the Allies advanced, there was a driver on that road making it possible. The Germans watched the chaos of Allied supply lines and believed it was their chance. They thought the bottleneck would strangle the invasion, force the Allies to stall, maybe even retreat. But what they underestimated was the power of a system designed to grow, to bend, and to scale without end. The Germans believed this crisis would stall the Allies, but they underestimated the determination of a system designed to scale without end. August 1944. Midnight in northern France. A lone convoy growls down a country road, headlights blacked out to avoid detection. Engines rumble, tires crunch over gravel, and drivers strain their eyes to see just a few yards ahead. One wrong turn could mean plunging into a ditch. One glint of light could invite a Luftwaffe attack. This was the Red Ball Express. To keep the lifeline flowing, the U.S. Army organized the convoys with strict precision. The routes were one way, controlled like arteries of a beating heart. Supplies flowed east toward the front, empty trucks raced back west to refill. At the peak of its operation, nearly 6,000 trucks ran the route daily, a constant cycle that never truly slept. The men behind the wheel were mostly African-American soldiers, many of whom had been relegated to service roles by a segregated army. Yet here on the Red Ball Express they became indispensable. Without them, the advance across France would have collapsed. Discipline was brutal. Drivers were ordered to keep their trucks rolling at all costs. If a vehicle broke down, it was shoved off the road immediately. Mechanics worked in the open fields, patching engines in the dark. Every delay risked clogging the lifeline, and in war, time itself was ammunition. The dangers were constant. Luftwaffe fighters, though weakened, still prowled the skies. Strafing attacks scattered convoys, forcing drivers to dive for cover as bullets chewed up the roads. German patrols lurked in forests, ready to ambush stragglers. Even fatigue was an enemy. Men drove for 20, sometimes 30 hours straight, nodding off behind the wheel, jolted awake by the scream of a horn or the crunch of gravel. And yet, the convoys endured. For the drivers, the road became a kind of crucible, exhausting, terrifying, but strangely unifying. They gave their trucks nicknames. They sang songs to stay awake. Some painted slogans on canvas tops, "Keep 'em rolling." Others taped photos of loved ones to dashboards, reminders of why they pushed on through the night. Every truck in the chain carried more than supplies. It carried the weight of an entire army's hope. Gasoline cans for tanks that would spear into Germany, ammunition crates that would pound enemy strongholds, medical supplies for the wounded, food that kept soldiers moving through the mud. The convoys became a psychological weapon too. German forces, starving for fuel and struggling to move artillery by horse-drawn wagons, looked on in disbelief. Their intelligence officers tracked the endless stream of trucks, reporting with a mixture of awe and despair that the Americans seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply line. The Red Ball Express was not elegant. It was noisy, chaotic, and dangerous, but it was relentless. It never stopped. And that relentlessness wore down German morale more effectively than any single tank assault. The symbol was clear. Where the Allies advanced, the trucks followed. Where the trucks went, the war machine lived. One German officer, watching from afar, admitted bitterly, "The Allies' greatest weapon is not a tank or a plane. It is their truck." In Berlin, reports began to pile up on the desks of generals and intelligence chiefs. Reports of convoys, and more convoys. Endless movement, endless supplies, and then, one chilling report landed in Berlin that stripped away the last illusions of victory. German intelligence officers tracked the convoys relentlessly, until one chilling report reached Berlin. Autumn 1944. Somewhere along the Siegfried Line, German generals gather in a cold command post. Maps spread across the table, candles flickering against concrete walls. Their armies are retreating, their supplies dwindling, and yet the enemy keeps pressing, faster, stronger, seemingly without pause. At first, they refuse to believe it. Reports from the front are dismissed as exaggerations. Endless Allied convoys, trucks that never stop, supplies flowing like water from a broken dam. But then, through field glasses and reconnaissance patrols, the truth becomes undeniable. The Americans are not slowing down. They are speeding up. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most brilliant armored commanders, later admitted in his memoirs that logistics had doomed them long before the first tanks crossed the Ardennes. German divisions were starving for fuel, short on ammunition, their artillery silenced not by enemy fire but by empty wagons. He compared it bitterly to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. Only this time, the opponent was not winter, but American industry captured German officers, described their disbelief at the sheer abundance they saw in Allied camps. Where German soldiers rationed a few crusts of bread, the Americans seemed to feast. Where a German tank crew might hoard their last drops of gasoline, the Americans filled cans by the truckload, spilling fuel without concern. One intelligence report to Berlin in late 1944 carried a chilling line. "The Americans have supplies without end." For men who had been taught to believe in the superiority of German planning, it was a revelation as painful as it was devastating. Every convoy that rolled past their binoculars was a message written in steel and rubber. The war was unwinnable. In diaries and post-war testimonies, German officers confessed to the moment their hope died. General Alfred Jodl, later tried at Nuremberg, admitted that by late 1944, the Allies' mastery of supply left the Wehrmacht with no means of matching them. Colonel General Franz Halder wrote bitterly that American logistics were a second front in themselves, one Germany could never overcome. To the men on the ground, the symbolism was overwhelming. Their divisions, once feared across Europe, now crouched hungry and immobile, waiting for fuel that never came. Meanwhile, across the hills and valleys, American trucks rolled like a living tide. It wasn't just steel and gasoline they carried, it was inevitability. The sight hollowed them. One young officer wrote in his journal, "We can fight the soldiers in front of us. We cannot fight the factories behind them." That realization cut deeper than any defeat in battle. It was not a question of courage or even strategy. It was the cold mathematics of war. An enemy who could resupply endlessly would always outlast an army forced to ration. The endless trucks became a prophecy on wheels. Each one carried not just supplies, but the message that Germany's entire war plan was collapsing. Yet, the trucks were not just about supplies. They represented something even larger, the collapse of Germany's entire war plan. September 1944, France is ablaze with movement. American and British forces surge forward. tanks cutting through hedgerows, artillery pounding retreating German lines. At the forefront, General George S. Patton's Third Army races east, covering more ground in a single week than many armies in months. His secret weapon? Not daring maneuvers or audacious tactics, but an endless stream of trucks and fuel. The contrast with German logistics could not have been starker. Where the Wehrmacht had once relied on horses and limited rail networks, now their tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline. Fuel depots that once supported blitzkrieg operations were destroyed or captured. Trucks that might have carried ammunition were nowhere to be found. German officers calculated, rationed, and prayed, all to no avail. For the Allies, fuel was a weapon as lethal as any artillery shell. Every truck that rolled forward delivered gasoline, spare parts, and munitions, ensuring that the armored spearheads could maintain blistering momentum. Patton's tanks didn't pause to resupply. The convoys reached them and the machine of war pressed on mile after mile. The irony was cruel. Blitzkrieg. The doctrine Germany had perfected, speed, shock, and decisive thrusts, was now being executed against them. Powered not by genius alone but by the logistical might of a nation across the Atlantic. Every tank Germany built for rapid offense was countered by an Allied system that could move hundreds of trucks and thousands of tons of fuel faster than Germany could respond. German generals, watching their fuel-starved divisions falter, understood the bitter truth. They had unleashed a doctrine that now destroyed them. Because they had underestimated the industrial capacity of their enemy, blitzkrieg was no longer theirs. It had become the Allies' instrument. The consequences were immediate. German positions collapsed under armored pressure. Retreats became routes. Panzer divisions meant to counterattack were immobilized. Entire units surrendered not to bullets, but to the relentless advance of supply lines that never paused. The Red Ball Express, the hundreds of fuel convoys, and the meticulous planning behind them ensured that speed, the lifeblood of blitzkrieg, was now fully exploited by the Allies. The battlefield became a corridor of motion, and the Germans could only watch as the weapon they had pioneered turned into a hammer over their heads. It was not simply a war of firepower, but of movement, endurance, and logistical foresight. The Americans had discovered that the shortest route to victory was paved not just with steel, but with fuel, wheels, and a vision that stretched far beyond the front lines. And just when the Germans hoped for one last counterblow, the endless trucks ensured it would fail. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest is cloaked in darkness and snow. Hitler's last gamble is underway. The Wehrmacht launches a massive offensive, hoping to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. It is the Battle of the Bulge, a strike meant to paralyze, to shock, to change the course of the war. German forces moved swiftly, initially catching the Allies by surprise. Tanks crash through forests, infantry swarms over frozen hills. But even as the assault begins, a critical weakness gnaws at the offensive: fuel. Germany's panzer divisions are no longer self-sufficient. They rely on captured depots, hastily siphoned supplies, and dwindling reserves. Their speed, once their greatest weapon, is throttled by the reality of logistics. Across the front, the Americans respond with grit, ingenuity, and above all, mobility. Convoys of trucks continue to roll, delivering fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements directly to the threatened sectors. The Red Ball Express adapts, rerouting trucks through icy roads and narrow passes to meet the frontline demand. Even in chaos, the supply lines remain a steady heartbeat beneath the turmoil. German generals watch in disbelief as their carefully calculated gamble begins to unravel. For every tank that advances, a convoy of Allied trucks ensures that another counterattack is waiting, fueled and armed. For every German breakthrough, the Americans plug the gaps with an almost supernatural efficiency. Soldiers on both sides recall the stark contrast: German units freezing and running out of gasoline, while American forces drive tanks and trucks tirelessly through the snow. The gamble, meant to strike terror and collapse supply chains, only highlights the overwhelming logistical advantage of the Allies. By Christmas, the offensive has stalled. Villages that were to fall remain in Allied hands. The Ardennes, meant to be a decisive corridor for German victory, becomes a graveyard of tanks, trucks, and dashed hopes. The way to the Rhine is open, and German resistance is steadily being pushed back, not solely by bullets, but by the relentless rhythm of wheels on frost-covered roads. The German army, once proud of its speed and tactical brilliance, now finds itself outmatched by a different kind of weapon: continuous movement, planning, and industrial might. The realization is bitter, undeniable, and crushing. By 1945, German generals weren't asking if they'd lose. They were asking how long the trucks would keep rolling before Berlin fell. Spring, 1945. Europe is a continent scarred by 4 years of relentless conflict. The Allied armies push deeper into Germany, moving over hundreds of miles with astonishing precision. Trucks, jeeps, and armored convoys carry the lifeblood of war: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, reaching frontline units faster than the Germans can react. Every mile they advance, the highway itself becomes a weapon, carrying the full force of American industry directly to the battlefield. Germany, by contrast, is collapsing under its own limitations. Rail lines lie in ruins from constant bombing. Bridges are gone. Fuel is scarce, and much of it must be improvised from captured depots. Horse-drawn wagons still pull artillery, struggling through mud and snow, a grim echo of a bygone era. The contrast is staggering. One side moves as a living organism powered by wheels, engines, and endless resources. The other is tethered to exhaustion, scarcity, and despair. The war is no longer decided solely by courage or tactics. It is being won on highways by logistics that never falter. Convoys snake across Europe like arteries feeding a massive, unstoppable body. Commanders on the front lines no longer shout orders simply to attack. They coordinate timing, fuel delivery, and resupply schedules with the same intensity as battlefield maneuvers. Every German counterattack, every desperate effort to hold territory, is undermined by the relentless rhythm of Allied trucks. The Americans have mastered not just movement, but the ability to maintain momentum across vast distances, ensuring that no offensive slows for lack of supplies. Where Germany once relied on brilliant, rapid strikes, it now finds itself defeated by endurance, by the capacity to keep moving, to keep delivering, to keep rolling forward with perfect discipline. Soldiers write home of roads clogged with convoy after convoy, of endless chains of trucks glowing in the twilight, of drivers who never sleep and engines that never fail. These wheels, unglamorous and overlooked, carry more power than any single division, more impact than countless battles. The Allies' success reveals a profound lesson. In modern war, victory belongs not only to those who fight hardest, but to those who supply fastest, who maintain momentum, and who transform industrial might into battlefield reality. Logistics, often invisible, often uncelebrated, has become the decisive weapon. And so, when the smoke cleared in Europe, history remembered the tanks and generals, but overlooked the true secret of victory. May 1945. Europe lies in ruins, yet the memory of movement, momentum, and supply lingers. Amid the ruins of shattered towns and bombed-out factories, one image endures: the endless line of Allied trucks, stretching as far as the eye could see. Soldiers recall how these rolling machines delivered life itself: fuel for tanks, food for troops, ammunition for artillery, and how they never stopped, day or night. It was not the tanks that carried victory, nor the brilliant generals alone. It was the lifeblood of logistics, the arteries of war that kept the Allied machine alive and unstoppable. The Red Ball Express, in particular, became a symbol of this unseen power. African-American drivers, young men who had faced segregation at home, became the backbone of the operation. Their courage, endurance, and relentless motion ensured that every advance could continue, every victory could be exploited. Their work was not glamorous, but it was decisive. It was proof that preparation, discipline, and resourcefulness often outweighed raw battlefield heroics. For German generals, the memory was haunting. Across decades of post-war testimony, they admitted the crushing despair of watching the supply lines roll by, knowing that no matter how clever their tactics, no matter how bold their counterattacks, the Allies would not stop. Each convoy was a message. The enemy's power was not only in guns and tanks, but in an industrial system so vast, so well organized, that it could absorb any setback and still deliver victory. The lessons carried forward into modern military doctrine. After the war, armies around the world recognized that mobility and logistics are inseparable. Supply chains, transport networks, and industrial capacity are no longer background details. They are decisive factors. A well-fed, well-fueled, and well-supplied force can achieve feats that a poorly supplied one cannot, regardless of valor or strategy. The war had demonstrated, in the starkest terms, that victory depends as much on the flow of supplies as on the fight at the front lines. And yet, the image that lingers is simple, almost poetic. German generals weary, binoculars in hand, staring helplessly as trucks roll past. The snow crunches under wheels, engines hum, and headlights pierce the dawn. They understood at last what their armies could not overcome. A system that never tires, never halts, and never yields. Victory, it seems, was not just about battles won, or cities captured, or tanks destroyed. It was about continuity, endurance, and the invisible, unstoppable rhythm of supply. The convoys of the Red Ball Express, the endless trucks stretching across Europe, became a monument not only to ingenuity, but to the truth that in modern warfare, the war is often won long before the first shot is fired, in factories, on assembly lines, and on the unglamorous but vital roads that carry life to the front. And so, when the smoke finally cleared, history remembered the tanks, the generals, the battles, but the real victory belonged to the convoy that never stopped rolling.